Hi, all. Welcome to part two of a three-part mini-series that we're working through to set the stage for the upcoming podcast, History Comes Alive with Jeff Nichols. In our first discussion, we asked and began to answer the question, what's the purpose of government? In this second part, we'll ask the question, what do you really know about American history? Is familiarity with a name or a place or an event or a time or even a time frame, is that the same as knowing? No doubt memorizing names and dates can make you look smart. It can help you answer lots of trivia questions. Think about it though, to trivialize something is to minimize it. If something is trivial, it's of small value, it's inconsequential. And so I wonder, can the same information represent both trivia and knowledge? Let's take U.S. history, more specifically, the office of the president. How much do you know about the office of the presidency? The men who occupied the office. I remember my friend's daughter years ago would recite in order all the U.S. presidents from George Washington right through Bill Clinton, who was the president at that time. She rattled those names off as if she was reciting the alphabet. My friend would beam with pride every time she did it. It sounded very impressive. She was the only person in the room that could do it. But did she know the presidents? Could she tell you anything about them? What wisdom did those names afford her as she rattled them off? You see, although her ability to memorize names in order was impressive to hear, it was more like a parlor trick. It was trivial, inconsequential to knowing or to understanding the real history of the presidency. See, real useful knowledge is gained when you try to understand the role that these men played in our history. What did they stand for? What did they believe in? What did they represent? Why did they believe the things that they did? What was their motivation? And who were their adversaries? What was the opposition really like? What motivated them? What did they stand for? Why did they have the opinions that they had? There's two maxims or cliches that I try to keep in mind when I'm considering history, when I attempt to know something, to understand with the intent of applying to my own life. The first one is, to the victor go the spoils. Generally, the winner of a contest gets the prize. Material goods, land, wealth, reputation, or possibly control of the narrative of what happened. There's always another side. The second cliche is, the first casualty of war is truth. Sun Tzu, the famed Chinese strategist some 25 centuries ago, wrote, all warfare is based on deception. The practice of American politics is often a bloodless war. I think it's easy to apply these concepts to history. In the context of those who won the day, their day, and recorded their position, not just the happenings that have been handed down by those who were there, but those who were able to establish the baseline, to frame the argument of what happened. Controlling the narrative, not outright lying, but nuancing the events, smoothing over their own blemishes, exposing the blemishes of their rivals. The recordings that we accept, usually without assessing them in the context of the original contemporary setting. That is to say, when disagreement, when conflict comes, physical, intellectual, doctrinal, political, if you can best frame the popular argument, you can win public support most of the time. Regardless of facts or truth, we do this in our own lives all the time. Now, it may be subtle and nuanced, but the official records will validate the victor or the one who's framing the argument. And that's good for you. It's good for your side if you're the winner, but it may not be good for those trying to know what actually happened. The primary principle of conflict resolution is to find out what really happened. Knowing something, understanding, involves considering both sides of an issue, or multiple sides, as is often the case. Subtlety and nuance have to be fleshed out. The question is, do you want to flesh it out? I mean, do you really want to know what happened? Can you handle the truth? The key is to evaluate, to measure, and to compare people against the backdrop of their contemporary setting. Not my setting and not yours, theirs. What was the world like? What was normal? What was exceptional when they were alive? It's a critical activity. It must be done intentionally, not for trivia's sake, but to really know. Experience and opinion do not always equate to knowledge. So I ask again, can the same information represent both trivia and knowledge? It doesn't seem like it's natural to critically assess anything. I mean, oftentimes our personal preferences and biases influence our opinions above fact or reason. They can be more powerful than we realize and extraordinarily difficult to let go of. We don't think too hard about history. I mean, let's face it, we trivialize it. I mean, we love it when it supports our view. Politicians, whether professional or the armchair type like myself, often quote the same documents and the same people. They reference the same events to support opposing views. And both sides have conviction, and both sides have confidence, and both sides can be very compelling. Often, one or both sides have failed to move from a position of mere trivia to knowledge. And they talk right past each other. We tend to filter history. We launder and we sanitize history subconsciously. We have an expectation that our audience, our people, either use the same filter or may ultimately adopt ours. It becomes circular reasoning, dismissing an opposing view before we even heard it. It's nothing new. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. This is an age-old problem. Plato recorded in his day, roughly around the time of Sun Tzu, the allegory of the cave. An observation of human nature. Now, imagine this scene. A group of men living in a cave, deep within the cave, chained, shackled to the point they can't turn their bodies or their necks. And they're standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder. And they're facing the back of the cave away from the opening. Now imagine this scene, if you will, if there's a fire burning, a large fire, behind the men facing the wall. The fire is large enough to cast shadows. Now imagine if between the men and the fire is a path with a low wall in front of it, separating the fire from the men. Now along this path, behind the wall and in front of the fire, there's a line of men walking in sequence. They're carrying various objects. And they're casting shadows on the wall in front of the men who are chained. The men carrying the objects in their shadows look very different than they actually are. And they're talking, their voices are echoing off the walls of the cave. Now those shadows and the echoed voices would be the only reality that the men who were chained had ever experienced. That's their reality. Their perception of reality then would be distorted. The men disfigured, the voices muffled, all very non-distinct. That whole scene is a caricature at best. It's reality that's been trivialized. Now imagine if one of those men was suddenly freed from his chains. It sounds liberating, but he'd be stiff, perhaps intimidated to move. What if he was forced to, though? To turn his body and his head, maybe for the first time in his life, and walk toward the fire. Away from what he was used to, away from his friends, away from all that was comfortable and familiar. He was forced to walk toward the entrance of the cave. Now imagine the pain that he'd feel having been constrained for so long as he moved, as his eyes adjusted to the light of the fire. Imagine the possible confusion as the light of the fire revealed the true images of the men walking and the objects that they were holding, replacing the shadows. Imagine how that man feels when he recognizes the passing men with objects as they really are. It would force him to recognize the clearer reality that he was now experiencing. Further still, if one forced him to travel farther up the cave toward the opening, past the wall and the men and the fire, he might fight it. I mean, now the pain in his body and his eyes would really force him to wince and recoil. As he adjusted, he may be unable to see at all. But he would, however, slowly adapt, slowly bring clarity into focus. Once adjusted, he would realize for himself just how distorted his original view had been. Now imagine if you let him out of the cave altogether. He would see for the first time the outside world, the sun and the trees and the clouds and the blue skies. That man would feel the outside world, the sun and the breeze and the fresh air. He would hear the outside world, the birds and the leaves rustling. Think about that experience against the backdrop of life deep within the cave. An experience so different from the cave that it would prove very difficult to explain unless someone personally experienced that. It's transformational, undeniable, liberating. Now consider if this man was to go back into the cave where he had been, where he had lived all of his life. As he entered, his senses would again betray him, as his eyes would again have to readjust to the darkness of the cave. A temporary blindness might set in, and then the fire would illumine the back of the cave once more. But this time he would know the distortion for what it was. The images, the sights, the shadows, the echoed sounds. Now imagine the others, those who had not had his experience, still standing where he left them, in chains, side by side, staring at the same wall, at the same shadows, watching the same men, hearing the same echoed voices, comfortable in their collective group experience, their camaraderie and their bondage. How would they react as a group to their friend when he returned? What would happen if he tried to tell them about the greater world outside, the more realistic reality, the bigger picture that he had experienced? Understandably, they would have some semblance of community, an order to their bondage. I mean, after all, this is all they've ever known. Imagine if they had a system to recognize the various shadows on the wall in front of them. The men walking behind them with objects in their hands, between them and the fire, casting different shadows. Voices echoing off the walls of the cave, all around the men in chains. Suppose they praised one another for predicting the correct sequence, each time men walking behind them completed their rotation. That is to say, even in their distortion, there was a sense of normalcy and order. Do you think the liberated man, now that he'd been enlightened, would want to go back to where he had lived? Positionally, experientially? Would the chained men, as a group, be able or willing to relate to their fellow former captive? I mean, let's put this another way. Would the enlightened man ever want to return to the distortion of his previous existence? And how would his old gang react to him now, as he denied the validity of the shadows and spoke of things much more clearly? The chances are they would think he was crazy. They may begin to warn each other of the dangers of the outside world. It would appear that leaving the safety of the group had somehow blinded the man who now saw. They may reject him as, or the fact that they may reject him is predictable. They may even become violent, tearing him limb from limb. History bears this out. Plato was recording Socrates from an actual debate about education. Socrates, the one who gave us the Socratic method of reasoning, asking questions to deduce a logical conclusion, removing emotion and personal bias and opinion from a topic to come to a sound decision about something. Isn't this a true depiction of so many situations? I mean, it's almost autobiographical for Socrates. I mean, what happened to him in the end? Capital punishment. He so aggravated the system around him, he was forced to consume hemlock and he died. Many of the men that we celebrate were rejected by their contemporaries. What do we do to each other when our world is challenged, when we receive new information that confronts or challenges our beliefs? Someone with a different background or experience comes on the scene. You see, the question isn't about whether we change or don't change, but rather the question is, what do we do when we receive new information? Do we evaluate it against known, quantifiable data? We tend to be guilty of filtering history, dismissing a counter-narrative in the name of emotion and preference, not truth, leaving us ill-equipped to critically assess information at all. We can be impatient, clumsy with facts on things that really matter. Remember in our first discussion, George Washington's take on personal interest? How men tend to act upon those things which are in their own interest, most of all? That without interest, a man's attention won't stay focused very long on very many things. So we ask the question again, what's the purpose of government? Is it to provide the greatest satisfaction to the greatest number of people? I mean, we asked that a couple of ways. We framed that question, is the government's purpose to protect the masses from evil and evildoers? Is it to empower each of us to fulfill our own self-interest to the best of our abilities? Is the purpose of government really only about the economy, stupid? When men are comfortable, when they can weigh the advantage or the disadvantage of an action, they're often willing to overlook injustice to maintain their own comfort. We depend on the masses to behave for our own safety as we move around society, don't we? For this to take place, men must either be placated or controlled. And they cease to critically assess the things that really matter. We amuse ourselves with trivia in our contemporary society. The danger, which is almost a predictable outcome, of comfort and ease is apathy. The failure to stay engaged when the consequences appear harmless. We'll spend hours studying our fantasy football draft, which is really quite a trivial pursuit, memorizing players and names and stats, yet we appear to lack the attention or the desire or the intellectual maturity to actually consider an issue of importance, to work through the various implications. Often there appears to be a direct correlation between how quickly we dismiss an idea and how much it aggravates our experience, unless our interest is engaged. And you know what? I think understanding the organization and the functionality of our society is in everybody's best interest. Nobody's perfect. No society, no government, no generation. But you can measure and quantify the results of actions. You can measure the results of actions against the results of other competing actions. Ideas have consequences. There are many cultures and people groups that I find very impressive. Some from relatively recent times and some from farther back in our chronological history. The people of contemporary geographical Russia, China, India, Iran, the Persians have extraordinary histories. These are hardy, determined, proud people with great and colorful pasts, much to be admired. But the contemporary landscape is dominated by the United States of America. Good, bad, or indifferent, that's a true statement. Now, I believe in American exceptionalism. I don't believe in American perfectionism. The Founding Fathers are national heroes in the United States of America, and they should be. But they were treasonous criminals to the crown in 1776. They were brilliant and flawed. They were wise and divided, sometimes bitterly. Their stories must be told and understood from the contemporary culture that they lived in. I mean, Thomas Jefferson seems to have had a problem with just about everybody at one time or another. But they were united by common interest, primarily economic liberty. It's an odd kind of collective unity for diverse self-interest. Do you believe the founders of our republic were the purest examples of honor and virtue? Were they men of the highest integrity? I mean, by whose standards can you even ask, let alone answer that kind of a question? Are you asking it from the perspective of contemporary culture? From the patriots in their day? From the point of view of the British Crown? How about the Native Americans? Or the French or the Spanish? To the victor go the spoils. The framing of the argument. Opinions about the Founding Fathers' motives are subjective, but the result of their experiments is quantitative. Were they visionaries of a universal fraternity and brotherhood? Were they self-motivated? How were they perceived by their contemporaries? I mean, the revolution itself was not always very popular among the colonials. I've heard a statistic that it never really reached more than about 30% of engaged popularity. That's a low number. Stephen Monsma, when considering the founders of the current federal government, the designers of our Constitution, This is a little bit of a review from our previous discussion, but from a little different angle. When he was considering the founders, the drafters of the Constitution, the creators of our federal government, he asked the question, were they far-sighted statesmen attempting to construct a document based on sound principles of government and aimed at creating the best possible system of government? Or were they narrow-minded politicians attempting to create a government that would best protect their own economic self-interest? Interesting questions. Consider the view of three prominent founders. George Washington. He referred to the general public as the grazing multitude. The grazing multitude. When I use that phrase, do you think of cows or lambs, sheep? More than likely, it's one of the two. What do you think about the grazing multitude? What's the picture that we get? One animal amongst many that are just like it, chewing on their cud, not thinking about a whole lot, oblivious to anything going on around them more than 50 yards away. Only concerned, only interested in the pasture immediately in front of them. George Washington thought of the general public as the grazing multitude. John Adams is vice president, the second president of these United States, did not deem the general public good in their natural, uneducated state. John Adams did not deem the general public good in their natural, uneducated state. Lastly, Thomas Jefferson, most confusing at times. He's such an interesting guy. We'll probably spend a lot of time on Jefferson, talking about a lot of his quirks. This guy's a walking contradiction. Case in point, Thomas Jefferson is said to have echoed the sentiments of Rome's Cato, famous senator, preferring the plowman over the professor. That is to say that Thomas Jefferson said that he preferred the common man over the educated man, the regular guy. But Thomas Jefferson also opposed direct elections by the people of the Senate because, quote, a choice by the people themselves is not generally distinguished for its wisdom. Thomas Jefferson believed that a choice by the people themselves is not generally distinguished for its wisdom. As a matter of fact, the direct election of the United States Senate by the people was not established until the early 20th century. Now, considering the founders in their contemporary setting, there's three takeaways, 3 points that we want to further develop as we move forward in this series. The first one, like all men, the founders were probably motivated in part by self-interest. It doesn't mean the whole system is bad. It means they were human. Because again, we've already asked the question, would you design a system that protected or threatened your self-interest? Secondly, the founders were sharply divided in their convictions. And it showed in their rivalries, many of which were very public, some of which were treasonous, and some unto death. And thirdly, most notably to me, the Constitution itself and the Bill of Rights or the Bill of Compromise or the Bill of Federal Limitations, not federal empowerment. The Constitution came many years after independence was secured. The current government, the Constitution, was not our original government. The current Constitution moved away from the original vision of the Revolution. And it was contested by the Anti-Federalists, many of whose names we are familiar with. We don't hear much about the Anti-Federalists these days. Their arguments failed to win the day. They were not allowed to frame the argument of what happened. The narrative of the history of our country that we have inherited was not theirs. However, foreseeing many of the deficiencies in the government that we have today, we can still learn a lot from the Anti-Federalists. The original government failed. Many of us know this, but how many discussions have you been a part of that recognizes the government that was organized by the patriots, the provocateurs of the revolution, failed? What were its deficiencies? What were the debates really centered around? Where did they come from? The Constitution was the second organized government of these United States. What do you really know about U.S. history?